because this is my 6th time recording this video, and believe it or not, I downloaded a new version of Bandicam, which is my video recording software, and apparently the settings are all different, and I have been playing with them, and the first 5 times sounds beautiful on my computer, but when I upload it to YouTube, you can see me and my lips are moving, but you can't hear anything I say. So I don't know if I'm wasting yet another 15 minutes, but I am hopefully got it right this time. So I wanted to actually do this little video because I was noticing some things in the week 6 discussion that I don't want some of you to go off thinking are accurate, or that you have the right take on some of the legalities of things actually. And this isn't so much about ethics as it is more about certain laws. And so I wanted to dispel a few myths here and answer a few questions. So first thing is, a lot of you were talking about nonprofits and for-profits kind of interchangeably, particularly with regard to their fiduciary duties. So let's just talk about this. A fiduciary duty is a duty to ensure that your organization or corporation or institute, whatever it is, spends the money that you take in the way you are supposed to, the way you say you will, the way your formal documents say you're going to, in accordance with your mission if you're a nonprofit, for example. So fiduciary duty means that you have to safeguard that money that you get, whether it's from investors or donors. When money is handed to you, you have to safeguard that it is going to be used the way it's supposed to be. But nonprofit fiduciary standards require the nonprofits to spend whatever money they take in to further the mission. Whatever that mission is and however it needs to be furthered, that is what their fiduciary duty is. By complete contrast, for-profits, or at least publicly held ones, are required to maximize the profit-making opportunities for their investors. That is their fiduciary duty, is to make sure that they operate and make decisions that will allow them to squeeze more profits out of that, out of their work, so that they can give those profits, those excess revenues, away as profits to their investors. So that's just very different. Those fiduciary standards are very different, and I don't want you to confuse them. Now, as long as we're talking about profit, somebody else asked whether or not 501c3s are allowed to make any profit. Well, the answer is no, but let's back up a minute and ask what exactly is a profit. Excess revenues are not profits. They don't become profits until you hand them to somebody to take outside of the organization and spend any old way they want. Buy themselves a new car, put the money in the bank for a rainy day, go on a hot vacation, you know, get their nails done. Anything at all can be done. Once you hand that money out, you have no expectations that it will come back in any way, shape, or form to the organization. That doesn't mean, I mean, nonprofits can't do that. They can't hand money away for that. But that doesn't mean that nonprofits don't have excess revenues. Somebody suggested that nonprofits are encouraged to spend all their revenues in order to keep their nonprofit status. Well, that's just not accurate. Nonprofits can have excess revenues. They don't become profits until they're handed away. So what can you do with those excess revenues? You can bank them. You can even invest them. Just like a family that puts away several months worth of money to cover expenses in the case of an emergency, a smart institution, whether government, nonprofit, for-profit, will also do the same. They will have a cushion of operating funds in case something happens that they can't anticipate, like a bad economic year or a traditional angel donor who suddenly dies and there's no money for you anymore from that source, whatever. It's good to have some money in the bank. Organizations can also choose to spend those excess revenues for things like giving raises to their staff. And that's not wrong unless those raises are excessive and extreme for what kind of a business it is. But if you think about it, many nonprofits start very tiny. And sometimes the founders are also the staff, and they don't even take a salary. What that usually means is they're working 2 jobs. They're working their nonprofit job and they're working another job to bring in money to support themselves. When the nonprofit gets to a place where it can actually give a salary, then it probably wants to, because that means that the full attention of the person who is receiving the salary can be put to the use of nonprofit. Or sometimes it's just about bringing people who work for you up to comparable standards with others who are doing similar work outside of your agency. The most disruptive and expensive thing for any organization is turnover. And when you have good staff, you need to pay them comparable wages and good benefits if you want them to stay. A nonprofit can hire more people so that they can reach more clients with excess revenues. They could use the money to research a new program idea and maybe roll out a small pilot to see how well it works. They could use the money to create more marketing materials or design a better website or start a newsletter or to put on a fundraiser. As they say, it takes money to raise money. They could buy new furniture if their sticks are falling apart, or they could lease a bigger place if they're getting more people. Anyway, they can do anything they want with those excess revenues without losing their status. What they can't do is give it away as profit. Okay, so let's switch gears. Erica was talking about, was asking the question about whether the Nature Conservancy offering big corporations slots on its leadership council, but then requiring $25,000 donations was ethical. And she said she guessed from a teleological perspective that it could be ethically sound. I want to back Erica up on that, and I want to make it clear that there's not even a fuzzy line about whether that's okay. And let's think about why that is. The comment that that was brought up in the discussion board had to do really with whether or not giving money and then getting all the attention of the nonprofit was somehow undue influence. Well, think about undue influence in a political situation. Think about lobbying and who is being lobbied. The people who are being lobbied and money is being given to their campaigns, and that may or may not be getting them a lot of access. Those people make policy decisions that become laws, rules, regulations, ordinances, and so they are using their money to further their own interest in ways that affect all of us. That is not the case with a nonprofit. Think of what the Nature Conservancy does. It buys up land to put, nature easements on them, conservation easements, and it runs science programs. And so, if you think about those things, buying land is a transaction. It's a commercial transaction, and if the person on the other side feels they're getting a good deal for their land and they want to sell it, there's no policy decision that's going to impact anybody besides the Nature Conservancy and that land. So this is very different. And to flip that around, you actually want a lot of interaction between your big donors and your organization, because the more they know about what you're doing, the more they see the impact that you're making, the more they understand the value of your programs, the more likely they are to keep giving or even increase their gift. So the $25,000 donor corporation this year, who has spent the year really getting involved and seeing how valuable and learning about your mission and about the cause, may end up being your $50,000 donor next year. Or they may agree to underwrite a pilot program when you want to try something new in full. So it's not the same. You're actually influencing your donor, not the other way around. So it is perfectly ethical. Now, I will say that there are times when a donor may come in and say, I will give you this amount of money if you will do XYZ with it. If XYZ is something you were planning to do anyway, in other words, if they want to put it to one of your programs, great. But if what they want you to do is something that takes you away from your mission, then perhaps you need to say no to that. In fact, therein lies an ethical dilemma that you will have to navigate. And if they really are taking you away from your mission, then the answer to that is you can't do it. But otherwise and generically, it's quite all right to take money, not really much different than having a board of directors that have a financial commitment that goes along with being on the board. We could talk about whether or not that's a good idea, but that is a whole nother subject, and sometimes it isn't. but we'll leave it at that for right now. Okay, so I'm turning my paper over. I have so much stuff to talk to. I don't want to forget anything. Okay, so some of you discussed the social media and what a great ethical tool it's become for transparency purposes, and yes, it has. But I want to just talk briefly about the limits of social media to be an influencer for ethical good. And I'm not trying to downplay social media, it's great, but there are times when it works better than others, and I just like to point that out to you. So we were talking about the Florida shooting and all the kids getting up and speaking out, and we talked about the Me Too issue that has come up. The thing that both of those have in common is that the people who the ethical breach is against are the ones who are speaking out. But consider a similar movement, if you will. The Black Lives Matter movement is a bunch of young people who are protesting being shot too often or too easily, primarily by law enforcement, who seem to have more of a hasty trigger finger when it comes to people of color. And that was also young people speaking out, but why didn't that work? What is the boundary issue there? What is the barrier? Well, I would maintain that there are 2 or 3 things playing into that don't play into the other things. For one, we as a community have something of a high respect and regard for our first responders, which includes police, and we don't want to be quick to judge them. For 2, the dominant society is white, and there is unfortunately a tendency to believe that if kids were in the line of fire of our good first responders, then they must have done something to deserve it. And I don't know why that's the thing that we jump to in the face of data that suggests that the shootings do in fact happen more frequently, but we do. And 3 is that Me Too affects everybody, and the Florida shooting was primarily white kids, and honestly, there's probably a bit of racism going on there, yes? Okay, so you can see that there are barriers that keep social media from being effective. I'm not saying it hasn't done some good for the Black Lives Matter people, but it's also been a vehicle for people who want to see that movement as actually being destructive. Okay, so here's another case where social media can't really do any good, and that's when the victims aren't part of the crowd on social media. So no amount of social media is going to help us really to know whether donors to the Clinton Foundation did in fact buy access to Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State with their donations, and whether Trump and his family are in some way beholden to the Russians. We can talk about it on social media, but we are just as likely to be leveraging fake news as we are to be sharing actual facts if we are not careful about how we talk about it on social media. What these situations require are somebody like a Robert Mueller, who has authority and jurisdiction to dig down into the actual facts, to actually use legal tools to force people to turn over evidence that will allow him to analyze whether or not a law has been broken or ethical breaches have occurred. So we can only talk about those kinds of things on social media, and we actually have to watch out for the flip side, and that is that we don't make things worse by the way that we follow through when we don't have real facts and data. All right, change subjects again. Wounded warrior story. A lot of people upset about that in the discussion board and also in real life. I thought I would do a little follow-up discussion about that. I thought you might be interested in knowing how much money the wounded warriors lost due to that scandal. This is a virtue ethics conversation around loss of reputation, and since the scandal, the Wounded Warriors have lost approximately $70 million in what they normally get. They're down $70 million, and I don't know how long it's going to take to repair their reputation. But the second thing I wanted to tell you is that they obviously ousted their executive director. They brought in a retired military commander to take over, hoping that the credibility of the military commander will go a long way toward repairing the credibility of the organization. I have links below this video, and you can go read both of those articles if you're interested. All right, and speaking about what happened since, I thought you might like to know what's happened to John Junker, the architect of the scam that happened through the Fiesta Bowl. Well, John Junker served less than 8 months in jail, and when he got out, he was invited by a guy named Steven Zabilski, who is the executive director of St. Vincent de Paul's, which is a large nonprofit in Phoenix that helps homeless and the hungry and people who are addicts and others get back up onto their feet, get the assistance they need no matter what it is. And Steven Zabilski invited John Junker to come in and get back on his feet through service. So he is still there, and he's been there for a couple of years. And I have given you an article telling you what he's doing there, and you can be your own judge of whether or not that's working. Okay, 2 more quick points, and I'll be out of your hair. Marissa made a great point about overhead. And how can we, or can we, use the percentage of overhead that a nonprofit is spending to determine whether they're ethical? And I just want to point out that I think we have the wrong idea about overhead. I completely agree with Marissa. We know factually that most organizations' overhead needs to cost them between 17 and 20%. And that is, unless, without even special projects like research and development or piloting a new program that requires some upfront money sunk in. This is just the regular cost to sustain an organization, give everybody reasonable salaries and so forth. So when you get a grant that allows you to use only 10% for overhead, you know that you're going to have to go out and raise some additional funds just to be able to sustain yourself to actually carry out the grants that you have taken on. And when you see people looking at GuideStar and other places trying to find the organizations that are only spending 3 to 5% on overhead, you really need to dig deeper to ask yourself whether or not those organizations are going to be sustainable in the long run. Now, there are probably some that have very low overhead because somebody is supporting the person who runs it. Like somebody has a independent source of wealth and doesn't need to take any money at all, and maybe it's maybe it's a family doing this and they're not taking any money, and so almost all the overhead has to do with supplies and communications, but that is very rare. So if you want to give to an organization that has that little of overhead, I suggest you dig down and see why they have that little bit of overhead and whether or not you think they're sustainable. Okay, last point. There was some talk on the discussion board about whether nonprofits can lobby. The answer is not no. The answer is big fat yes. Yes, you can lobby. The IRS has 2 different formulas to figure out how much you can lobby. One is roughly around 10%. That's not what the formula says, but I'm just telling you roughly. Don't live by that. You got to actually do the formula. And the other is a very complicated formula I'm not going to try to rough out for you. But in a $1 million organization budget, you could spend $100,000 of it on lobbying and advocacy and be fine. Now, what exactly is lobbying? I think that's probably an important question to ask, and you'll excuse me for a minute while there we go. I lost my window, so I didn't know if I was still recording. What is lobbying? Lobbying is where you give information to anybody who has any authority to make laws or rules or policy, and that's whether it's federal, state, local, city, etc., and try to get them to decide one way or the other about a law or a policy. But the part that makes all that educating lobbying is actually asking them to make the decision one way or the other. A nonprofit can actually do all the educating they want as long as they leave that ask off. So you can put all the same information in front of those decision makers, and not ask them what to do with it. Just leave them to come to their own conclusions, and that's educating, and you can do all the educating that you want.